I learned what betrayal weighs the night my own daughter nodded while her husband slid the bolt and the room bloomed with heat. The cabin wasn't a home anymore. It was a verdict, and the bourbon on my tongue turned to anesthesia. I heard his voice like a lullaby with teeth. "Plenty of air in here." That's when I understood the quiet math of their plan. Erase the father, inherit the fortune, rehearse the grief. I didn't burn. I crawled through a vent carrying nothing but breath and a promise. Documents don't burn, and neither does the truth. This is how a man buried by his family comes back with receipts and turns a private crime into a public reckoning. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back. Be part of the experience. If a moment grabs you, drop a comment with a timestamp and your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. I have lived long enough to know that silence can be a refuge or a trap, and most days I still can't tell which I'm building for myself. In Austin, the light comes thin and blue over the single-story house I kept after my wife passed, and the first sound is always the click of the garage switch and the fan whirring up like a patient dog. I move through the same sequence each morning: cover off the Triumph, hand to rag, rag to chrome, chrome to memory. The smell of oil is honest in a way people rarely are. When the cloth comes away clean, I feel like I've earned the right to open my laptop and stare at spreadsheets that no longer need me. The money came from Stratusforge, a name that sounded like we were forging weather. We were only building the quiet scaffolding of other people's brilliance, racks and links, and a discipline about failure that investors mistook for genius. I walked away when it was clear my staying would only feed my pride. 10 billion is an ugly number if you say it out loud. I don't. I let it sit behind the frosting of a trust, and I answer letters from kids whose handwriting leans uphill as if the slope of hope were real. A life of moderation looks like stinginess with a number like that behind it, but I never learned to spend as quickly as other men learned to ask. My wife still lives in this house by arrangement, if not by fact. Her scarf is a loose ribbon on the closet hook. Her notes to a younger me: buy bread, call the roofer, stay pinned on the corkboard like museum pieces of an ordinary devotion. On bad days, I trace the ridges of her handwriting and pretend that kindness was a habit I could relearn if I followed the strokes. On worse days, I read through server logs the way pious men read scripture, each time stamp a bead, each error a confession. Rachel left this house the way light leaves a room when someone shuts a door, completely and without apology. I told myself I was protecting her mother's memory when I put most of the fortune into a charitable structure that didn't bend to family weather. She told me I'd chosen strangers over my own blood. Perhaps both were true. What I know is that I couldn't bear to make grief a negotiation, so I made it a ledger and called it done. The silence that followed was my invention and my punishment. Connor was almost a relief at first. I have met two kinds of men in business: those who believe numbers are fences and those who think numbers are stories. Connor thought numbers were theater. He smiled with his shoulders, held every door, complimented the roast at Thanksgiving like it had signed an endorsement deal with him. He texted in tidy bursts of reassurance: "We got her. Family first. Let me take that off your plate." When a man reaches my age, he learns that help often arrives already priced. I filed the messages where I keep warranties I don't intend to use. Austin in the fall is a polite heat, the sun a little softer on the gravel, and the air brittle with cicadas. I walk the neighborhood in a brimmed hat and old sneakers, counting cracked sidewalks and thinking about the tiny acts that keep a man anchored. A neighbor waved and told me his son had gotten into a state college on one of our scholarships. I told him the boy had earned it and meant it. Back home, I made coffee like I learned in a cheap apartment, boil and pour, and ate toast over the sink like a man trying not to leave crumbs of himself behind. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon with a subject line that sounded like an apology offered in advance: "Just us, Dad." Rachel's message was longer than anything she had written me in 2 years. She said she'd rented a cabin near Asheville, that the leaves were turning, that it might be good to mark Mom's birthday with something other than separate rooms and separate memories. She added that Connor would handle everything and that I didn't need to bring anything except an open mind. I read it twice, then a third time, and felt that old braided tug of caution and hope. I am a man who pretends not to believe in signs. That day, the garage fan gave a small stutter and righted itself. The triumph started on the first turn for the first time in months. A solicitor emailed about elegant end-of-life instruments with an attachment named like a promise. Connor texted, "This will be good for Rachel," and added a thumbs up that I tried not to resent. I answered Rachel with 2 sentences. I'd come, and we could talk. When you've lived with the consequences of being right, you begin to value the small practice of preparing for being wrong. I made fresh copies of 3 documents that have saved me more than once: my trust rules, the emergency governance rider we'd baked into Stratusforge's bylaws back when my hair still listened to combs, and a letter to myself that I review when I feel I'm drafting a life on other people's terms. I scanned them to a drive I keep on a keyring, slid the keyring into a sock drawer beneath a tangle of receipts that look like chaos but are not. I tried my best to remember my daughter as a child without resizing her into something I could forgive. She had been fierce about fairness, prone to collecting slights like trading cards, tender to small animals, and unmerciful to bullies. I have a photo of her, 7 years old, arms crossed, lower lip out, standing between a neighbor boy and a stray cat as if the pose itself were law. If memory is a kind of inventory, I do not want to count only the hard assets. That night I walked the rooms with the slow, aimless drift of a man memorizing a map he might need to redraw later. I touched the framed wedding photo and straightened it a fraction of an inch. I sorted the mail and threw nothing away, as if the future might come looking for a clue I carelessly discarded. I told myself out loud in the kitchen, where my voice sounds most like my father's, that I would do less advising and more listening. "Don't rehearse the apology," I said to the empty room. "Rehearse the attention." The line made me smile, because it sounded like something my wife would pat my cheek for getting right too late. I turned off lights one by one, the house dimming like a stage before the overture. At the bedroom door, I glanced back at the hallway's narrowness and understood how a man's life can seem smaller just when he thinks it ought to feel earned. Then I slept and dreamed, as I often do, of a road that begins in sunlight and bends into trees I've never walked. The road up through the Blue Ridge curled like a careful question, each switchback asking whether I still trusted my own eyes. I lowered the window and let a cooler air rinse the last of Texas from my lungs. Maples burned in stitched patches against dark pine, and a creek beat time somewhere out of sight. From the turnout, the cabin looked postcard perfect. Close up, it felt curated within an inch of sincerity. The stain on the logs ran a shade too dark. The stone chimney stood more like a monument than a hearth, and the gravel was so evenly raked it suggested a broom, not weather. Connor waited on the steps, sleeves pushed to the exact inch that sells intention. Rachel hovered behind the door glass, her reflection layered with trees, as if she had not yet chosen which world to enter. I cut the engine and silence fell in a clean sheet. The front door opened on a hinge without history. Scent reached me first, new varnish under a sweeter note that hummed at the back of the throat, something faintly metallic, like a candle trying to disguise something it did not understand. Inside, the edits were tasteful in a way that canceled taste. Floating glass shelves where a lopsided bookcase ought to lean, a white sofa that made the timber look like a set. The handmade quilt that might have softened corners was gone. Family photographs had been replaced by cool abstracts expensive enough to pass for feeling. Heat registers hummed though the day was mild, and the thermostat wore a number people choose when they want a room to consent. In the kitchen, the pilot light glowed a notch too bright, the kind of blue a mechanic respects and a cook distrusts. Connor struck a match. The flame took the kindling in a confident column, no cough, no sulk, as if the wood had been coached. He poured bourbon into a heavy glass and held it out with the faint ceremony of a contract. Rachel followed with a glass of red. Her voice had the roundness of care and the caution of rehearsal. She spoke of simplifying paperwork, of a boutique firm that made probate painless, of sparing me calls and signatures so I could enjoy my time. She smiled, but it stopped a step before her eyes. I nodded as if persuaded, lifted the bourbon, and let it catch the light while I walked a quiet audit. Window latches the size of my thumb were flipped inward for bears, all of them uniform, all of them firm. The laundry pocket door slid into a cavity just wide enough to matter if the panel ever came off. The floor register by the sofa used Phillips screws, too clean for a cabin pretending age. The kindling stacked beside the hearth wore a faint sheen when the fire licked it. None of it proved anything. All of it added up. I had promised myself on the flight to speak less and listen more, so I listened. The registers breathed like a runner wanting a bench. The fire pressed a wall of heat out of proportion to its size. Rachel's ring clicked twice against the stem of her glass. Connor began the monologue men like him learn early, removing stress from my calendar, letting them own the boring parts, converting legacy to ease. He used the word legacy often and the word love rarely, a ratio I have learned to respect as data. I suggested we step onto the deck and catch the ridge at dusk. Connor patted the air with an easy hand and said we could do that after a few easy forms. The phrase sat on the coffee table like a paperweight. Rachel added that it would save me from all the calls. I heard the plural and wondered how many had already been made. I lifted the bourbon again, tasted its smell, and set it down. The wine waited, ruby, and still expectation poured into glass. The lights flickered once and recovered. A hiss in the kitchen did not grow, which almost comforted me, but it did not disappear. If I were a man who required permission to doubt, I might have granted it then and leaned back. Age has taught me that ignored anomalies become verdicts. I kept my body loose and my mind in its counting habit. I measured the room the way I map a rack. Vent sizes, screw heads, clearances, sight lines. I found the second exit with my eyes and memorized its latch. I checked the distance to my iPhone and the small key drive that rides my ring like a stubborn truth. On a kinder day with other choices behind us, this might have been reconciliation. A father learning to be less of an engineer and more of a participant. A daughter remembering that some preferences are actually vows. I let that better version stand long enough to steady my breathing, then filed it with other contingencies I once hoped to need. Attention, not accusation. Presence, not performance. If there was a bridge left between us, it would need quiet weight, not words. We crossed a rope bridge of small talk, testing each plank before we put weight on it. I asked how long they had had the place, whether the contractor was local, whether the chimney drew well in wind. Connor answered easily, almost musically. Rachel smoothed her skirt and let a detail contradict itself by a hair. Closing on a Tuesday, the permit posted on a Friday, a county away. I set the discrepancy down in the part of my head where facts wait on a neat shelf until they are needed fast. Evening gathered along the ridge until the windows wore the color of bruised fruit. The register sighed. The key ring on the table flashed with a clatter of identical cuts. I adjusted the line of my coat and felt, beneath the cloth, the outline of the phone, the rectangle of the key drive, and my pulse tick up one count. Hope is a good servant and a terrible guard. I chose composure. I kept the chair they had offered. I watched the fire do more work than its size should allow, and memorized one more path from seat to hall, hall to deck, deck to ground. When the quiet deepened by a notch I could feel in my teeth, I smiled the way a guest smiles who intends to stay present. I told myself to keep listening, keep counting, keep my hands where they could choose. The mountain night pressed its face to the glass. The room warmed past comfort into something practiced. Nothing overt had happened, and yet the script had advanced a page. I set my palm on my knee to steady the tremor I did not want to name. The flame leaned higher, polite as a man holding a door that leads somewhere he has already measured. Heat thickened until the room felt padded, a softness that wanted to slow my thinking. The bourbon had left a faint shimmer on my tongue, not quite citrus, not quite clove, something numbing that edged outward and left my lips tingling. I set the glass down and let my fingers rest against the wood, long enough to feel vibration, the tiny thrum that travels through studs when a flame learns the habits of a house. The pilot hiss from the kitchen had lost its shyness. It held a steady note now, as if the room had tuned itself. Connor moved easily, the way an usher moves when a performance is about to begin. The first bolt slid with the small, satisfied sound of good machining. A second hardware piece, the kind you buy to quiet worry, clicked into place above it. I looked at the windows, latches uniform, levers flattened so they wouldn't catch a sleeve. The pocket door to the laundry eased shut on its magnet and stayed closed as if it preferred its own company. When I stood and reached for the deck handle, it turned without releasing, the polite lie of a prop that has been fixed for this exact scene. Morning in Austin arrives with a brightness that forgives walls for what they held yesterday. I unlocked my study and let the door rest against the stop, breathing the familiar dust that softens Texas light. The scarf my wife left behind hung on its hook like a sentence with the verb missing. The trim needed a cloth. The air already knew it would be a warm day. I stood in the center of the room and admitted a truth that had been circling me since the arrests. The crisis had moved from my family into institutions. Once I recognized that, my breath lengthened. Rumination wastes oxygen. Action is better. By noon, Ruth and Mason were at my kitchen table with legal pads and coffee that refused to stay hot. We named the thing before we built it. Hearth safe. We wanted a word that remembered both danger and shelter. The mission fit on a sticky note. Hotline, traveling legal triage, and financial probate screening for elders who feel the floor move under their feet. Mechanics came next, a P.O. box at a post office that never asked for stories. An EIN application submitted with Ruth's competence humming behind each field, a pro bono counsel intake Ruth could spin up in an afternoon, and an intake form that asked for only what mattered. I paid a freelancer to stand up a modest page with a pledge that made no promises we couldn't keep, and a safety checklist whose verbs stayed short. In the afternoon, Jonah came into the light. A secure call first, then video. He looked like the memory I had kept on a shelf, but older in ways I deserved to see. He accepted a volunteer role as technical steward and immediately started making my life easier. Hardened communications, incident tickets with simple categories, and a ledger for notarizing documents for clients who didn't know the difference between cryptographic and cryptic. I felt the ache that comes when a truth you delayed arrives fully formed. I chose clarity over apology and told myself that a father-son reckoning would happen on a day with fewer fires. We co-wrote a practical deliverable because purpose likes a list. The senior's home and paperwork fire drill took shape in 10 points. Don't sign at night. Build a cooling-off period into every life-changing decision. Require dual witnesses unrelated to anyone who benefits. Keep an audit trail for keys and locks. No changes without a third-party check. Photograph every page before it leaves the house. Record who is present. Use cryptographic notarization only with a second factor you control. Keep independent emergency contacts. Make 2 copies of proof and store them in different places. Call us before you call the person making you hurry. Ruth cut jargon until the sentences breathed. Mason added evidence hygiene to 3 bullets with the patience of a man who has testified more than he has slept. Jonah insisted on minimal tech steps any 70-year-old could follow without cursing. We launched softly. The site went live with no confetti. Cynthia's victim witness unit agreed to route vetted referrals. We would not become a rumor mill. Ruth booked a small church basement for a talk with metal chairs and stale coffee in a parking lot that connects people to one another faster than programs do. I recorded a short audio message for callers who reached us after hours. No drama, just a voice that says, "You are not crazy, you are not alone, and here are the next 2 things to do." Boundary setting is part of safety, so I made one that cost me. Through my attorney, I left a single voicemail to the jail intake line for Rachel. Not forgiveness, not accusation. I stated I would speak only through counsel. I added that if she chose to cooperate truthfully, I would not obstruct any petition for leniency that prosecutors deemed appropriate. I refused any private meeting for now. The words were clean and dry because anything wetter would spill. Cynthia kept the updates brief enough to respect the living. 2 paralegals at Kincaid and Rowe began producing internal memos. Noor's name lit up at airports. Financial preservation orders crawled across Ava's feeder accounts, a bureaucratic tide doing its good, slow work. She flagged a grand jury calendar and told me to expect subpoenas to bloom like dandelions. I answered each message with acknowledgement and nothing extra. Witnesses get in trouble when they enlarge their footprint. I tried to make my voice plain. Let's step out and take the air. It sounded even to me like a man reading instructions he already doubted. Connor's smile didn't shift, it simplified. Plenty of air in here, he said. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. The heat did the raising for him. Rachel stayed by the sink, a glass nested in both hands, as if she needed its weight to stand where she had planted herself. When Connor glanced over, she gave a small nod. No drama, no flourish, only agreement polished down to a point. I felt something in my chest surrender a name it had guarded. Whatever daughter I had been narrating to myself so I could keep walking toward her, she ended here, in that inch of chin. I took it as a fact, not a verdict, because facts will carry you farther. The fire climbed in steps too regular to be natural. Logs don't usually learn choreography, but these did, catching top to bottom with clean lines, no smoke sulk, no damp cough. The scent sharpened into a sweetness that had no place in timber. Heat lapped along the floor the way I've seen coolant creep in tight piping before it bursts. My mouth began to sand itself from the inside. I did what I know, reduce the frame, breathe low, conserve motion, make a list. Tools, register screws at the floor vent, 2 clean Phillips heads, coat hanger by the door, thin steel, better than nothing. Pocket inventory, phone, key drive, handkerchief, paths. Hall to deck, locked. Kitchen to side door, out of my line of sight. Vent to crawl space, narrow but not impossible. Time, tight. I tried one last offer because sometimes a sentence buys 30 seconds. Shared management, I said evenly. You take point on accounts. We review quarterly. It costs you nothing to slow this down. Connor shook his head, gentle as a hospice nurse. Rest, he said. Warmth. A man who plans to harm you and wants to hear himself called kind will choose those words. He didn't look at Rachel again. He didn't need to. I went to one knee as if my shoe demanded it. The room leaned with me. I slid 2 fingers into the register grate and felt the paint edge sharp and recent. The screws resisted, then gave the quarter turn that promises the rest will follow. I used the keyring as a makeshift driver and kept the motion small, wrist only, breath steady. The hiss in the kitchen thickened. A spoon clinked in a pan that had no one at it. I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth. When the second screw came free, I palmed it. Habit learned in server rooms where floors eat the hardware you need most. I lifted the register and fed it under the sofa, then flattened and put my shoulder to the dark. Fiberglass welcomed me with its fine, democratic bite. The space was a whisper high, studs ran like ribs, ducting shone where the light from the hearth could find it. Smoke pools, heat flows. I kept low enough to taste dust and something sticky that clung to my lip like sap. Behind me, the room spoke in a different grammar. A log collapsed with the polite apology of a stage effect. The bolt settled deeper in the wood with a note I knew from workshops and locked doors. A heel clicked once, then found stillness. Connor's voice dropped to a murmur I couldn't parse under the new roar of draft. The house had decided to draw. Crawl spaces teach a man the uses of his elbows. I used mine like paddles, pulling forward an inch at a time, trying to keep my knees from snagging on nail ends someone had not meant to leave, and I blessed that someone for their incompletion. I counted studs in prime numbers to track distance without thinking about it. At the third span, a thicker pipe forced me to angle. Chest scraping, shirt riding up, skin taking memory it would keep. I held the handkerchief to my mouth and tasted laundry soap from months ago and ash from right now. Cool found me in a seam where foundation gave way to grade. The earth breathed, and I breathed with it, shallow and quick, eyes watering until the crawl space blurred into something that could have been a tunnel in a younger man's story. I slid out onto the slope behind the cabin, and gravity adopted me with a firm, impersonal hand. Leaves helped. So did the thin skin of rain that had hung in the afternoon without committing. I rode the hill to the line of trees and let my hands learn bark as a new kind of proof. From the cover of Laurel, the cabin looked smaller, then larger, then like a thing that had wanted this all along. Flame took the eaves, paused as if impressed by its own reach, then licked upward and found a tongue on the roof. The chimney, too much monument for a hearth, threw sparks like a bad idea. I swallowed the impulse to run to the road and make it a public emergency. I had been a public man once without meaning to. I was not going to be a public corpse. I put the phone in my palm and made the one call that would not multiply my story before I could own it. Ruth answered on the second ring and did not waste either of our air with surprise. "Where?" she said. I gave her the coordinates the way a man gives a confession. Simple, nothing extra. "Stay off the road," she said. "Cut cross slope." Follow the water when you hear it. The creek's small percussion found me then, and I set my feet to its time. My hands shook, a private weather I allowed without commentary. The mountain night let me pass. I moved through its understory the way a wire moves through conduit, slow, purposeful, turning where the bend demands. When the wind shifted, smoke tried to follow me and then lost interest. I kept my phone dark and the key drive hard against my thigh like a sacrament. Somewhere behind me, glass went to language and failed. The world made room for the next hour, and I walked into it because the only other option was to lie down in the old one and let it finish what it had started. Ruth met me where the gravel shoulder widened to a view of nothing. Her old SUV eased in with headlights low, the engine idling like a throat clearing. I climbed in and shut the door on the mountain air and the glow behind us. She didn't ask the kind of questions people ask to feel useful. She handed me a thermos cap half full of something that stung kindly and set a battered first aid kit on my knee. The back seat held a wool blanket, rolls of gauze, and a grocery sack folded into itself the way frugal people fold time. She dabbed the red edges at my wrists, wrapped my raw knuckles, and spoke as if we were already in the next hour. "Sim out," she said, holding up a cheap burner. I slid the card free and watched her bag my phone in foil. "Motel off 74, she added. "Exterior doors, no questions." The room smelled like old HVAC and lemon cleaner. Ruth locked the chain, drew the shades, and set the thermos on the unit under the window. She placed a legal pad in front of me and a fine point pen that made smaller letters than my hand wanted. "We start here," she said. "Timeline, present tense, exact words, no metaphors, no memory fill. You are not composing, you are recording." I let the pen anchor me and wrote the sequence clean. Connor at the bolt, Rachel's nod, the hissing line, the shine on kindling, the half-turn of the register screws, the crawlspace grit. I listed the uniform latches, the thermostat too warm for the day, the white sofa that looked staged rather than sat in. I wrote Connor's sentence about warmth and rest, and I wrote the way the bourbon had hummed in the mouth. Ruth read over my shoulder and made small check marks, not corrections, just a rhythm to keep me moving. At dawn, the knock came soft and twice. Ruth opened to a man built like a good hinge, all function, no flourish. "Mason Quill," he said by way of greeting. He moved a chair to the desk, set down a notebook fat with purple ink, and lined up a pocket USB duplicator beside his laptop as if he were laying out surgery. He didn't bother with sympathy, which felt like mercy. "To stop a hound, make it chase," he said, as if reciting from a manual only he owned. "They think you burned." We let them run toward that idea, then we turned the road. He proposed a visit to the house Rachel and Connor had rented down in the valley, while they accepted condolences and performed grief. We cased the street first. Mason strolled the block like a man counting mailboxes, noting which cans had been dragged to curb, which porch cameras watched the walkway, which neighbors stared, and which pretended not to. The side yard offered a gate with a latch that preferred company. Mason slipped a thin shim between strike and tongue, raised the latch with a motion so modest it could have been a shrug, and we stepped in sideways. Inside, lavender candles met a thin line of bleach, a combination that suggested both staging and cleanup. The living room was a smaller echo of the cabin's taste, glossy, spare, curated to the inch. He moved with a practiced quiet, not peeking so much as listening for objects that didn't belong to themselves. At the bookshelf, I found nothing but hardbacks selected for spine color. In the kitchen drawer, a laminated card with 3 bullet points titled, "In case someone asks," lived below a nest of rubber bands. The card's phrases were tidy: confusion, frailty, accidental fire. At the desk, a manila envelope marked "Utilities" held exactly 1 bill, and tucked beneath, a death certificate template with a cause typed in and the date blank. I photographed it with the burner and returned it to its bed as if it had never been lifted. What we needed, if the world was going to listen, lived in Silicon. I noticed the tower speakers flanking the TV. The left sat heavier on the rug, angled a degree off its twin. I knelt, eased the cloth grill free, and felt along the inside edge. Tape caught my fingers. A 2.5-inch solid-state drive sat tucked near the crossover wires, snug and smug. Mason's eyebrows rose a fraction. We freed it and tethered it to his duplicator. His screen announced itself with the humility of good gear, a progress bar and a device ID. The volume label read "Snowmelt," the kind of misdirection that passes for wit when people think they're the only ones in the room. We didn't browse. We imaged. I called out hashes, Shay 256 strings like prayers said backward, and Mason wrote them in that purple hand. Once the clone landed, we opened directories long enough to confirm categories without getting lost. Scripts for interviews using the right mix of sorrow and certainty. Clinical evaluations with Dr. Silas Noor's signature in a blue that wanted to look wet. Probate packs pre-filled by Kincaid and Rowe with a small artistry of forms that know where they're going. A spreadsheet titled "Flows," showing money stepping through shells like dancers changing partners on cue. Timestamps gave us their arrogance. We closed what we had opened and backed out the way we came in. Prints wiped, speaker reassembled, register of the room restored. At the motel, Ruth logged chain of custody in careful lines, and I made 2 clones, one to an encrypted SSD that rides my keys, another to the folder she keeps behind an office painting that isn't worth stealing. We agreed to what none of us wanted to want. No police yet. This was bigger than 2 ambitious people playing cruel. Networks require rope, not thread, and we had just found the free end. Relief came like a cold cloth to a working man's neck, edged with the knowledge that I had walked out of one fire into a larger combustion that spoke in legal stationery and billing codes. When Mason left for a nap that he called a reset, I sat with the legal pad and wrote 3 lines to the version of me that will try to run too fast when attention gathers. Patience beats anger. Proof beats eloquence. Stay smaller than the story until the story is too big to swallow you. Ruth dozed in the chair, shoes still on, the kind of rest that veterans of long rooms learn between alarms. I watched the motel clock count to an hour with no events and let the trembling reduce by degrees. The burner pinged once with a sound like a polite hand on a door. The subject line read, "I'm on your side." Inside sat a single screenshot from an internal Stratusforge panel I hadn't looked at in years. It showed a pending filing to shift voting control to a family foundation with Rachel as trustee, authored by Ava Park under the soft camouflage of succession hygiene. Below the image, the message continued in 4 short lines. "They moved early. It's not final. I can stall 3 days. J." The signature froze me harder than the content. Only one person in my world signed that way. Jonah's initial sat there like a door I'd bricked up with good reasons and cowardice. I could feel the past reach for my throat, then let go. I typed a single reply that said less than I felt. Received. Thank you. Move carefully. Ruth woke at the sound of keys and watched my face gather, then arrange itself. "Friend or trap?" she asked. "Both until proven otherwise," I said. She nodded, already updating the map. Inside the machine, someone I had no right to ask for had chosen to be mine anyway. Outside the room, time narrowed. Evidence had given me weight. The email gave me a clock. Morning found me at Ruth's kitchen table, the laminate clean and patient, the coffee strong enough to hold a man upright. We stacked our universe in 3 neat piles, the snowmelt clones labeled with tape and hashes in purple ink, my motel-written timeline with check marks marching down the margin, and a short stack of photographs printed on a cheap laser that made the ash look like newsprint. When Cynthia Hale arrived, she knocked only once and stepped in with the unhurried exactness of someone who keeps her promises. She set a small recorder beside her badge, flashed the badge once, and asked for chain of custody as if it were a sacrament. We went minute by minute. Mason read the hashes aloud. I matched labels to times. Ruth filled gaps with dates and addresses. Cynthia's questions were plumb line straight. Who touched what, where it lived at each hour, what I could swear to, and what I could only infer. She pressed 2 places where my memory wanted to reach, and I trimmed language back to bone. Then she opened a laptop with stickers that had earned their scuffs and pulled up a map America-shaped and crowded. Red pins marked places I would have driven past without learning their names: county seats, lake towns, mountain edges, North Carolina, Vermont, Arizona, others. Each cluster bore a short note. Each note carried a pairing I recognized now that she traced it with a narrow pen: probate filings by Kincaid and Rowe, cognitive decline evaluations bearing the wet blue signature of Dr. Silas Noor, money washing through shells curated by a tidy hand, Ava Parks. She said my case was the first time the script had failed in the first act. A witness not reduced to a death certificate is a fact no lawyer can sand flat. The map did not feel like vindication. It felt like altitude. Exposure, she warned, does more than light the room. It invites attention from people who prefer dark. She asked if I was willing to be a present-tense complainant, to put my name and pulse and verbs where the allegations lived, to testify later when the board flipped from suspicion to evidence. I thought about the old habit of staying behind the servers I built. The good cover anonymity gives a coward and a craftsman. Being a spectacle would cut me on the days my hands shook. Being a fact might keep the next father breathing. I said yes. She did not thank me. She wrote it down. Her doctrine was elegant in its restraint. Let them run the play they rehearsed, from accidental fire to grief interviews. Don't tug the line hard enough to make them look behind the curtain. Let them step exactly where they've always stepped. Arrive with documents and timing that force the floor open. The task force would start subpoenas quietly: bank, carrier, clinic, firm. No sirens for a day or 2. I had to accept the itch of waiting, the sense of watching a small fire fatten so a larger water could find it. Governance would be shield, not sword. Years ago, in a conference room where coffee went cold just as earnestly as it does in court, I'd worked with early counsel to draft a rider that looked paranoid until the day it isn't. If credible evidence suggested an attempt on my life, voting control at Stratus Forge would auto-escrow into a trust designed to do nothing but keep the company honest. I pulled the language from a file that smelled of the decade it was born, firmed it into a present-tense affidavit built on my motel timeline, and asked Ruth to notarize at her kitchen counter with the stamp she reserves for days when paper needs to speak louder than people. Then the packets marched. I filed through the SEC's integrity channel, attaching hashes, photos, and the affidavit, knowing that markets hate uncertainty more than they love narrative. I sent a formal notice to the Stratus Forge Audit Committee, triggering the clauses that force independent review whether anyone wants it or not. I sent a careful envelope to a local journalist in Austin who had never burned me when stories got hot. The note set an embargo and a condition: no release until law enforcement moved and the company acknowledged receipt. Accountability, not splash. Insurance against accidents of any kind went into 3 envelopes. Ruth's safe behind a stencil print of a bird, Mason's off-site box that lives under a different name, my own keyring, heavier now with an encrypted clone that felt like a coin in a gambler's palm. I walked the house once more and let the old lawyerly superstition run. Say aloud what exists, so it is less likely to vanish. We made a few controlled ripples. I logged into a legacy admin portal to set access alerts so I'd know which doors someone tried in my absence. I changed nothing else. The point was to be alive in silence, just enough to make Connor and Rachel lean into their grief script rather than plot a new one. Let the momentum finish what it had started. Meet it on the other side with a ledger time, can't argue. Austin required signatures, witnesses, a stamp that would pass every skeptical thumb. I flew back on a flight full of people who spoke in airport voices about weekends and weddings, carried my folder like a passport, and stepped into my study as if the room might ask for identification. Dust had settled on the trim, the fan clicked the way it always had, and my wife's scarf waited on its hook with the kind of patience that both saves and scolds a man. A mobile notary I trust arrived with a stamp and a practiced neutrality. We signed at the oak desk where I once taught Rachel to reconcile a checkbook. I left that memory alone on the shelf where it belonged. Scans went to cloud buckets with keys only I carry. Paper went to envelopes with clasps I bent flat. The notary left with a nod that said my name would stand where I'd put it. I walked the house once, turned off lights the way a man thanks a room for its service, and went back to the airport with less than I'd arrived with and more than I could count. By evening, I was in Asheville again, the air thinner with intention. Cynthia had built a quiet perimeter around the Valley rental, a listening post that was legal, neighbors briefed only by absence, a couple of cars parked where they looked like they belonged. She gave me rules I could follow, no heroics, no improvisations, no words I hadn't written first. I carried the snowmelt clone, my affidavit, and a folder of photographs that would fit in a code and still answer a dozen questions. Mason handled the lock with his modest conjurer's touch. We entered the house that had learned to sound like theirs and made it mine for an hour. Preparation for confrontation, it turns out, is more about subtraction than speech. I rehearsed stillness, hands open on the folder, feet planted, jaw quiet, no flourish. Sit like a man who owns his breath. I reminded myself that reconciliation was no longer a plausible outcome, only clarity. If I kept the room level, the evidence could speak when it must. I took a chair directly facing the door, set the folder on my lap, and listened to the house calibrate around a different center of gravity. Far off, a car climbed the road and downshifted. The refrigerator cycled with a sound like a held breath. The day thinned to evening and then to something tauter than dark. This net was wider than family now, a pattern that stretched across counties and states and habits of grief. I was simply its first unavoidable node, sitting where a father would sit if he had one last useful thing to do with his name. Chapter 6. The Decision. The door opened on night air and the small sound keys make when people expect a quiet house to accept them. Connor stepped in first, posture set to casual, the way a man wears a coat to hide his weather. Rachel came half a step behind, her laugh ending on the threshold the instant her eyes found me. I had chosen the chair that faced the door and set the folder on my lap as if it weighed less than it did. The refrigerator hummed. My pulse counted along and then refused to be the louder of the two. I let the silence work. It is the most honest instrument I own. Connor's shoulders pinned, then tried to round again. Rachel's breath hitched and flattened. Her gaze moved over the room, mapping exits and distances the way I had mapped vents and latches. I kept my hands visible, palms light on the folder, the way you set your fingers on a piano to show you're not going to drop it. I did not open with the speech. I placed a single photograph on the coffee table. The cabin as it was, beams honey bright, my wife's handwriting on a beam end. Beside it, the same angle in ash, framing torn to bone. I laid down a small anti-static sleeve holding the snowmelt clone, the label neat and ugly with its own confidence. I slid 2 pages after that, a draft probate packet from Kincaid and Rowe with language already in place for a life I had not lost, and the decline evaluation signed in a blue that worked too hard to look wet. On top, I set my affidavit, notarized at Ruth's kitchen counter, the stamp clean in its rectangle. "Documents don't burn," I said. The line was simple enough to hold and heavy enough to land. Connor smiled in the way dealers smile when they think you've brought cash to a table with mirrors. He talked about confusion, about safety, about comfort for everyone if I would just let them help. Rachel did not join him. She asked very softly, "What do you want?" I said, "Clarity." The room signed its consent to the scene. The refrigerator cycled down and gave the floor back to us. I explained without heat what already existed beyond the edges of this furniture: chain of custody on the drive, hashes, timestamps, filings already logged with the SEC and the Stratusforge Audit Committee, the dead man's governance rider that moved voting control into escrow upon credible evidence, which I had now provided in the form the rider required. I did not point. I did not lean. I let each sentence sit where they could see it. Connor drifted toward the table, a slow tide toward the folder that wasn't his. He tried on the grief script again, mentioning how hard it had been to watch me slip, how devoted they were to keeping me comfortable. The words had the right vowels, they just arrived in the wrong order. I kept my hands on the folder and did not adjust my chair. I said the writer's language again, verbatim, because precision is a kind of mercy when the room wants to argue about weather. "Pressure makes men show their plumbing." Connor's mouth tightened around a line and then let it out too fast. "Nobody else had the stomach to clean up legacies like this," he said. Not a metaphor, not a plea, a thesis. The sentence exposed scale and intent in one breath. Rachel flinched as if the air had moved differently around her face. The entry was quiet and complete. A door at the back opened with a soft authority, and Cynthia Hale stepped in with 2 agents at her shoulders. Badges, then voices, the cadence that keeps rooms from breaking into several smaller rooms. She addressed Connor by his full name and told him what would happen next. His hands went behind his back the way hands learn to do when they've practiced in their owner's head for longer than they admit. Rachel remained standing, eyes wide and empty of everything but the fact of my body. Cynthia's gaze flicked to the table, photo, sleeve, pages, affidavit, and she nodded once to the agent with the evidence kit. The agent gloved up and set down labeled bags with a choreography that would survive later scrutiny. Cynthia reminded me, without moving her mouth much, that I was the complainant, not the arresting party, and that I should stay within my affidavit. I answered with a small, literal nod and kept my seat. Rachel's phone vibrated on the console and bloomed to life with a name on speaker she had set to override her silence. Ava's voice entered the room too bright. She spoke about a power of attorney already in PDF, about signatures captured at Kincaid and Rowe, about how the mess could be contained if I would just stop making it public. She told Rachel to put me on and she would walk me through the dignified path. Cynthia's eyes cut to the device, then to me. I did the simplest thing I know how to do. I disproved a lie with arithmetic. I read aloud the PGP checksum of my legitimate signing key, the one notarized against my instruments for 5 years. I quoted the short fingerprint from memory, a habit acquired back when trust still meant math before it meant marketing. I said that any valid instrument from me would be recorded against a cold key ledger maintained off-network and co-signed by a second factor under Jonah's custody. Then I spoke the block height and hash for the last valid document I had executed. The PDF Ava was selling did not have those anchors. What it did have was a date that did not agree with my geolocation in Austin, a timestamp that betrayed a different time zone, and a file name that had traveled through a machine with a printer driver Kincaid and Rowe did not own. Cynthia nodded once more, and the agent plucked the phone off speaker into a bag as Ava insisted that she had never forged anything in her life. For a moment, the noise fell to human size. Connor shifted in the cuffs and said nothing. Rachel's face destabilized. Something old passed between us, her at 7, chin out, and hurt by the world on behalf of a creature smaller than herself. Me at 30, thinking my job was to anticipate every threat for the people I loved until I became one of the threats by confusing control with care. Recognition is not rescue. I let it be recognition and kept my hands where I had put them at the start. Cynthia worked the room with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly which inch a defense attorney will try to pry open later. She had an agent inventory electronics in situ, photograph cable arrangements, and log MAC addresses as if they had feelings. She read Connor his rights with the clarity of a woman who had repeated this sentence enough times to make it a bridge for both sides. She told Rachel she was not under arrest at this time, and then said the words that mean more than they sound like. It would be in your interest to sit down. I felt the decision settle, not theirs, mine, hours ago at a kitchen table with a stamp, but the weight of it arriving in my bones. Public, not private. Legal, not familial. Irreversible, not theatrical. The small part of me that had kept a cot ready for a reconciliation lay down and folded the blanket for another man to use. The larger part, the one that had climbed through a vent and counted studs in the dark, did what it had come to do. Hold still until the facts were louder than anyone's version of me. As the agents moved, Cynthia's phone buzzed with a message I knew meant a second circle widening. Warrants drafted, Nor flagged, Kincaid and Rowe pinged in Boston, Ava's accounts preservation ordered. Rachel finally sat, hands clasped so hard the knuckles paled. She looked at me with a child's flicker that did not request and did not offer. I returned it with a father's steadiness that does neither. The refrigerator hummed again, back on schedule, and for the first time since I picked this chair, I exhaled all the way to the bottom. The choice had been made, and now it would live its life. The cruiser idled at the curb while Cynthia walked me through the driveway air like a diver guiding someone up from a pressure change. She had me read the evidence bag IDs off the labels so they lived in my mouth as well as her log. The agent echoed them back. Ruth wrote them in her tidy block on a yellow pad. The chair had left a dent on the fronts of my thighs where the folder rode. When I flexed, the imprint tingled and then let go. Inside the house, the refrigerator hummed on its ordinary schedule, the sound strangely polite after a night that had rearranged the room's center of gravity. Cynthia summarized charges like a ledger you can't pretend not to see: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, forgery, elder financial exploitation, wire fraud. Provisional, she said, with enhancements likely. Her team had warrants moving on 3 fronts. At Noor's clinic, they wanted records, devices, schedule books that remember what people forget. At Kincaid and Rowe, the target was probate drafts and client communications, the kind of emails that think they're smarter than metadata. With Ava, they were preserving accounts and imaging every device that touched the shell company flows. She did not slow for comfort. She did not raise her voice for emphasis. The facts were heavy enough. On the ride back to the motel, my phone, still on the burner number, pulsed once with an SEC acknowledgement. I read it twice. The dead man's governance rider had triggered, and voting control had been auto-escrowed into the Stratusforge Trust for open access until adjudication. The audit committee sent a separate notice of an independent review, the kind of dry paragraph that carries more electricity than a press conference. An alert from the legacy admin portal showed 3 failed attempts to access my key stores around midnight. Rattled adversaries jiggle the wrong handles. The logs told me they were awake and hungry. Reporters began to swirl before we reached the highway. Scanner chatter had spread a narrative outline thinner than the truth and stickier than lies. Cynthia told me to hold the line. No comments, no color, no corrections. "Your affidavit speaks," she said. Ruth fielded calls with a neutral phrase, no comment during an active investigation. An Austin journalist I trusted confirmed receipt of the embargoed packet and promised to wait for filings. I believed him because he had learned that keeping a promise buys the next story. Back in the room, Ruth unwrapped my hands and took her time with the ointment. The skin along the knuckles wore a new, tight shine. My ribs complained when I coughed. The throat held a dry scrape like a held note. Ice cracked in a paper cup and melted while the air conditioner worked at the drapes. I wrote an addendum to the timeline in the same hand I had used the first night, Connor's sentence about cleaning up legacies. The forged PDF Ava pushed on speaker, the PGP checksum and ledger proof that cut it down to size. Dates, times, words, verbs in the present so they would stay alive in the record. Mason arrived with the purple pen and his ritual. He logged Rachel's seized phone, the audio timestamps from the room, a photograph of the folder arrangement taken before the first agent touched the table. The chain of custody lines accumulated like a disciplined kind of mercy. I mirrored every new file to my encrypted SSD, then again to Ruth's safe. I sealed an envelope, wrote 3 words on the front, "If I disappear," and slid it beneath the motel Bible. Belief is a discipline even for unbelievers. I sat in the simple room and tried to understand my daughter in a way that did not flatten her into a single hour. She nodded before the fire and she sat after the cuffs. She is both. If I erase either, I'm lying to have a cleaner story. I drafted a short letter and did not send it. I wrote that clarity is not cruelty and forgiveness is not a door one person can open alone. I wrote that the door is not open and not slammed. It is guarded, and I am the guard because I survived. Then I folded the page and put it behind my driver's license where it could rub against something official. Cynthia's texts punctuated the afternoon. Noor's clinic was dark. A receptionist had arrived to find drawers disturbed and a server tower missing. 2 paralegals at Kincaid and Rowe were already talking, the kind of talking that happens when people realize they have been participating in a story bigger than their pay grade. Preliminary holds landed on Ava's feeder accounts, the legal equivalent of turning off a pump. A federal prosecutor asked for a proffer meeting with me as the first living witness in the cabin accident pattern. The phrase made me colder than the room. Inside the company, shock traveled the way current does, least resistance first. The audit committee emailed the board and senior staff a terse directive. All powers of attorney and medical capacity documents involving senior executives must be revalidated against original instruments and cryptographic signatures. Someone forwarded me the sanitized version. It read like a fire drill written by a lawyer. An internal whisper network pinged my name in a mix of disbelief and relief. Jonah checked in with a sentence that sounded like a lever snapping into place. Escrow live. 3-day stall successful. I read it out loud to feel the fact. I typed back, understood. Keep logs. Rest when you can. Cynthia called in the early evening to set boundaries with the respect adults give one another when they intend to keep them. I was not to contact Rachel or Connor. Any outreach from defense goes through counsel. My job was to preserve energy and be available for depositions, then court. Victim witness services would handle logistics, security, and the kind of details that wear people down. Boring is a tactic, she said. Let us take the noisy parts. I agreed. I have missed enough birthdays to know that attention is a battery. Night thickened beyond the drapes. Semis braided a sound along the highway that settled into the room like a tide. I inventoried the small things that keep a witness breathing. Extra charger, copied IDs, clean shirt, spare socks, 2 pens that don't blot, earplugs for the hours I'm supposed to be useful tomorrow. I set the folder on the desk and put a note on top for the morning. Read it once, not twice. Overreading turns proof into poetry, and poetry will not survive cross. Somewhere between the second cough and the third, I understood the pivot. I had been protecting myself and my estate by reflex, the way a man covers his ribs when the first punch surprises him. Now the work was larger and simpler. I was anchoring a case that could insist on a different way of seeing how elder exploitation hides in accidents. To do that, my language had to stay plain, my habits careful, my hours boring. Boring keeps a witness alive. Boring keeps a fact intact when storytelling tries to eat it. I opened my notebook and wrote 1 clean line where I would see it before anyone else saw me. Proof travels farther than grief. I closed the book, slid my shoes off, then back on again and slept with them by the bed, ready for subpoenas at dawn. Operational friction arrived like an old friend. Exhaustion makes habits useful. I took metadata snapshots by reflex, obeyed the 2 copies rule, and kept lists that forgave me for being tired. The printer hummed. The mute button on my phone learned to wear a thin dent, and more than once I found coffee I didn't remember pouring. Late in the day, neighborhood kids lifted their bikes off curbs and drew circles in the heat haze. Normalcy returned in honest textures. Then the system reminded me it was made of people. Cynthia called with a voice that did not waste adjectives. A junior agent named Dale Mercer had leaked detention timing to Kincaid and Rowe in exchange for money. Internal affairs moved quickly. Dale was suspended by noon. Integrity units lit up. Warrant schedules were resequenced so the case didn't collapse. I let the anger pass through and leave something more useful behind. Not only families burn, systems smolder too. Trust must be procedural, not personal. That night we added a chain of trust policy to HearthSafe, layered verification for all partners, three-way confirmations for sensitive steps, no single point of failure, and a public transparency report cadence that would force us to speak when nothing dramatic had happened. Letters began to arrive. Some were typed by grandchildren, some were written on lined paper with careful loops. I answered what I could with facts and a tone that refused the hero pose. I revised the guide where the mail taught me it was unclear. Don't sign at night became don't sign anything life-changing after 4 p.m. Use cryptographic notarization became ask a trusted friend to hold the second factor and tell no one who that friend is. A woman in Idaho wrote that she had taped our checklist to the inside of her pantry door. A man in Vermont said he had insisted on dual witnesses and watched a nephew choose not to be present after all. I filed those notes the way I file lab results. Proof that the protocol travels. I kept my promise to stay boring. Mason made fun of the alarm labels on my phone until he adopted them. Eat real food. Stand up. Boring saves you. I laughed and then obeyed. A witness who doesn't eat says foolish things. A witness who doesn't stand forgets he has a spine. The night before the church basement talk, I walked my house and tried to feel where it had given way and where it still held. The study carried its age honestly. The kitchen forgave the new locks. I printed 20 copies of the fire drill and hole-punched them like a man who knows he might need an extra hand tomorrow. I reminded myself that reconciliation is not today's project. Preventing the next accident is. I would show up, read the checklist, answer 2 questions, and go home. No panels, no performance. Work, not theater. Before bed, I taped the first printed fire drill to my own refrigerator. It wrinkled at the corners and then smoothed. I set a phone alarm and named it after the rule I intend to live by for a while. Boring saves you. I turned off the kitchen light and stood a second longer in the dark, letting the cheap plastic of the switch remind me that simple levers change rooms. The story had moved from survival to service. That doesn't make it noble. It makes it useful. I went to bed with a clear list, an honest fatigue, and the sense that what began in fire could continue in instructions other people can follow. The courthouse in Buncombe County smells like polish and old arguments. Floors shine enough to hold a reflection you don't want, and voices arrive in careful pieces edited by the ceilings before they fall to your ears. I sat 3 rows from the back, an old habit that lets a man leave if he needs to, with Ruth on my left and Mason on my right. Cynthia stood with the prosecutors at counsel table, posture squared to the day. My wife's ring lay cool against my chest on its thin chain, an honest weight. The folder on my lap stayed closed because everything that needed to be inside the record already had a stamp. The opening framed more than a family. The prosecutor spoke plainly about a pattern that dressed itself in grief. Cabins that burned neat, elders declared incompetent with convenient paperwork, probate filings that moved faster than mourning. He said my name once to make me a fact in the present tense. Exhibits rolled across the promise of the day, snowmelt cloned and hashed, probate drafts with someone else's idea of my future, Noor's evaluations that diagnosed a man without meeting him, a spreadsheet that walked money through shells like stepping stones, photographs of accelerant residues, utility timestamps, the 2 Phillips screws from a floor register that didn't want to let go. I let the words pass through and find their level. Forensics arrived first with the calm of people who answer to physics. An expert with sleeves that didn't quite reach his wrists explained how accelerants leave signatures even after flames attempt to erase them, how a gas line tells its own story if you give it the courtesy of a graph. He synced ignition events to utility data and made a column of numbers line up with a column of times until the room agreed with math. A digital examiner followed and spoke in hashes that felt like passwords I could still remember. He described how snowmelt had been imaged without touching the originals, how metadata shows the rehearsal of sorrow better than tears do, how a spreadsheet knows its true author even when it travels through 3 laptops and a prayer. Audio did what audio always does, reduce pretending. A clip from a doorbell camera let the room hear Connor's voice float up to the threshold on the night that began everything. Not "hope you like fire," the line he had earned in my head, but a softer cousin, warmth spoken like a test of how far he could bend the word before it broke. Another file caught an earlier argument on Rachel's porch about timelines and how to talk if anyone asks, the grammar of staging. The excerpt from Ava's speaker call hung in the air with its promise of a neat PDF and a dignified path that never asked what dignity requires. Faces in the jury box did not move much, but I saw one jaw set, then another. The judge watched the room lightly and order held. The prosecutor read 2 paragraphs from my affidavit without changing a word. The crawl space and the mouth tingle and the screws that came free in quarter turns, then committed. He did not enlarge me. He used me. I was grateful for that. The map came last and widened the walls, pins across states, memos from Kincaid and Rowe that taught language to grief, Noor's templates that mistook certainty for care, Ava's ladder of shells. Limiting instructions followed as they should, but the point had landed. The story that tried to make me a one-off knows how to repeat itself. The defense tried to take me back to a smaller room where confusion lives. They offered the incompetency narrative and the idea that grief has its own math. Cross-examination came with the old lure to argue, but Cynthia's hand on scope kept the railings up. The prosecutor returned to instruments instead of adjectives. PGP fingerprint, blockchain notarization entries, admin portal failed logins lined up with dates that matter. The dead man rider that moved control not by opinion but by trigger. An objection to pattern evidence stood, fell, and stood again. The judge gave it boundaries and let the map stay. Rachel walked in like a person who understands that the hallway outside a courtroom is shorter when you have already told the truth once. Cooperation had a shape I could recognize, if not love. She answered and did not dramatize. Meetings, Noor's appointment where my decline was signed without my presence. A paralegal at Kincaid and Rowe who taught them which words sound sorrowful without admitting anything. Connor's leadership. There were moments where her face flashed with the child I remembered, and then the expression reset to the woman I did not know well enough to anticipate. She did not look at me. I did not try to catch her eye. A life that stakes itself on clarity cannot afford rescue fantasies at noon. The jury listened with the stillness of people who know they will be asked to add weight to a scale. They relaxed during the technical proofs as if grateful for a kind of certainty that doesn't require virtue. Murmurs rose once when the forged power of attorney unraveled under checksums and a timestamp that lied about where I had been. The judge's voice brought the room back into its edges without force. Time folded on itself as it does on long days that borrow from the night. Deliberations took less time than the years that had led to them. We were told 2 hours, and my body counted in slower units. Breaths, steps, sips. I read the boring saves you note on my phone and obeyed it. When the jury filed in again, the air shifted in the way people believe only they can sense. The 4-person stood. Words lined up. Guilty on attempted murder, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on fraud, guilty on elder exploitation. It sounded like a list someone else should carry. Rachel's plea to reduce charges lived in a separate language the court reserved for what cooperation buys. The judge remanded Connor and set schedules in a voice that did not require sympathy to be humane. He thanked the victim witness staff. The prosecutor nodded once at me without turning it into a show. Outside, Asheville gave us a thin rain that put a clean on everything without insisting on it. Reporters gathered at a distance behind the line Cynthia drew in the air with her presence. "No comments today," she said before anyone asked, and the questioners understood that silence sometimes has a badge. Ruth opened an umbrella and we fit under it like people who had stood under smaller roofs together. Mason smiled the small grin he reserves for machines that do what they are supposed to after a long repair. I felt closure not as triumph but as completion of proof. I had wanted the facts to travel farther than my voice. They had. I flew back to Austin that night on a plane that smelled of disinfectant and patience. The garage light came on with the same click. The scarf remained on its hook with the same grace. 2 letters waited on the kitchen table under a magnet shaped like a bird my wife once thought was funny because it looked more like a potato. A woman in Idaho wrote that she had taped our checklist inside her pantry and that the shape of her evenings had changed because the phone was off after 4. A man in Vermont wrote that when he announced he needed 2 unrelated witnesses, his nephew decided the meeting would be better tomorrow, and tomorrow has not arrived. I answered both with 3 sentences each: protocol, not sermon, gratitude without a glow. I stood in the doorway of the study and accepted what the day had carved. I had lost an old family, I had acquired a civic one. Reconciliation was no longer a project I could run alone. Clarity was. The law had carried my voice past the place where voices get small. I did not need to keep speaking in the register that saved me. I slid a court-stamped copy of my affidavit into the flat file with other papers that matter for reasons beyond story. I pressed a palm against the checklist taped to my refrigerator and felt the paper warm slightly, proof of nothing and enough for tonight. On my phone, I set tomorrow's first alarm and named it the way I mean to live for a while. Be useful, not loud. Then I turned off the light and let the house memorize me as a man who has learned to leave rooms without taking anything that doesn't belong to him. Weeks after the verdict, the house learned my weight again. Morning slid through the blinds with Austin's unembarrassed light, and the garage greeting returned to its old order. Switch clicks, fan hums, cover folds, the triumph showing me my face in a softened chrome. I made coffee over the sink the way I did before the fire was a word I carried, and the smell reached the hallway where the trim wears fresh paint. New lock plates sit square in the jamb like someone shook hands with the door and meant it. Healing turns out to be maintenance, not miracle. Tighten what loosens, wipe what gathers, replace what fails without making a speech about it. Consequences kept their schedules without asking for applause. Connor stayed remanded while sentencing papers bred like forms do. Rachel met with prosecutors under her agreement and waited for a disposition whose language will never sound like anyone's family. Noor's clinic stood with blank windows behind brown paper while a docket line moved his name to the right. Kincaid and Rowe learned how discovery feels when memos are read aloud under lights, and Ava's emails told their own stories without adjectives. Cynthia's task force expanded into a grid of names and states. My part shifted from witness to availability, which is a kinder word for staying reachable and boring. I answered calls from investigators who needed a detail exactly as I had written it, then I went back to my list. HeartSafe grew at human speed. The church basement session finished without drama and made good room noise when chairs scraped for coffee. The hotline took a dozen calls in the first 2 weeks. 2 of them ended with a cooling-off agreement that bought a day, and a day was enough. One couple decided on dual witnesses after hearing the talk. For the first time in a long time, they felt more married than managed. I updated the fire drill to version 2, changing verbs where callers taught me they tripped. Keep 2 copies became, keep 2 copies in different places and tell one friend where the second is but not what's in it. Practical beats poetic. Jonah and I met for coffee on a park bench early on a Sunday, the kind of hour when runners look like promises people might keep. We talked work first because work is a bridge that holds when other structures sway. Ledger stability, the transparency report cadence, who signs the next release. Then we let silence do a little relational work. We didn't lean on it for more than it could carry. No grand reconciliation arrived to throw confetti. We agreed to meet monthly and keep the system honest together. When he stood, he put a hand on my shoulder the way you test if a wall is true. I nodded and let the moment be a plan instead of a performance. Through counsel, I received a short letter from Rachel that did not beg and did not fence. She owned actions in concrete nouns and named Connor's pressure without using it as an alibi. I answered through counsel with one paragraph. I would not obstruct any leniency prosecutors deemed earned. Any future contact would wait until the proceedings concluded and would happen only with a therapist or mediator present. The door is guarded, not barred. Guarding a door is a job. I can do jobs. In the end, fire did what it always does. It stripped the paint and left the grain. Ruin became revelation. Proof outlived performance, and quiet procedures outworked loud intentions. Justice didn't thunder. It arrived in timestamps, signatures, and people willing to hold a line. The lesson is clear. Patience beats anger. Proof beats eloquence. And a simple checklist can guard what love cannot. When the ground shifts, slow down, ask for a second witness, sleep on it, and let daylight test every promise. Dignity travels in small actions, repeated until they become culture. Thank you for spending your time here. If a moment in this journey resonated, tell us why and where you're watching from. Your experience may help someone else find footing. For more stories about resilience and quiet safeguards, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this with someone who might need a checklist more than a speech, and we'll keep showing up with work that's useful, not loud.